Picture a knight in shining armor, riding proudly beside Joan of Arc during France's darkest hour of the 100 Years' War. His name is Gilles de Rais, born into wealth, trained in the code of chivalry, and destined for greatness. In 1429, he fought at the Siege of Orleans, standing alongside the Maid of Orleans herself. For his courage, King Charles VII named him Marshal of France, one of the highest honors a warrior could receive. To his country, he was a hero, a man of loyalty and valor. But behind the glorious banners and noble titles, whispers began to spread, whispers that would one day eclipse his victories on the battlefield. Villagers told stories of missing children near his estates. Parents whispered in fear that their sons and daughters never returned after entering his castles. What began as vague rumors soon grew into a chorus of horror, echoing across the French countryside. The contradiction is almost impossible to imagine. The same man celebrated in church processions for his service to Joan of Arc would later be remembered as one of history's most notorious killers. How did a decorated knight, a national hero, fall so far into infamy? The legend begins in the years after Joan of Arc's execution. Stripped of the guiding star that gave his life meaning, Gilles drifted into a life of extravagance and excess. He staged enormous theatrical productions, burning through his inheritance to impress guests with music, costumes, and feasts. He built chapels, hired alchemists, and surrounded himself with mystics promising secrets of wealth and immortality. But while nobles saw his eccentricities as strange, peasants living near his castles began to whisper darker tales. Children vanished without explanation. Some were last seen near his estates, others lured away with promises of food or work. Parents wept and prayed, but no answers came. What could explain so many disappearances? Fear spread through the villages. They said the Marshal of France was hiding unspeakable secrets behind the thick stone walls of his castles. Later court records, drawn from witness testimonies, painted a nightmarish picture. Servants confessed that Gilles invited children into his chambers, only for them to never leave. Some spoke of strange rituals, of shadows flickering in torchlight, of the Marshal himself acting with terrifying cruelty. Whether these accounts were exaggerated under pressure or captured the terrible truth, one fact was undeniable. Too many children had gone missing, and all roads led back to Gilles de Rais. For centuries, historians have struggled with the question. Was Gilles truly a sadistic killer, or was he the victim of a political conspiracy designed to strip him of wealth and power? His crimes were so monstrous that some scholars have even compared him to Elizabeth Bathory or Jack the Ripper. Yet, unlike those figures, Gilles was not an obscure noble or a faceless villain. He was a celebrated war hero, a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Joan of Arc. That contradiction is what makes his story so chilling. He was not an outsider, not a nameless shadow lurking in the forest. He was part of France's elite, admired and respected, yet accused of preying on the most innocent. For the peasants who whispered his name in fear, he was not only a nobleman but a nightmare hiding in plain sight. This is where our story begins, not with his birth or his noble upbringing, but with the horrifying paradox that turned a Marshal of France into a symbol of terror. A man praised by kings and priests, later condemned as a monster. The tale of Gilles de Rais forces us to confront the darkest possibility, that even heroes can hide unimaginable horrors. To understand how Gilles de Rais could rise so high, and later fall so low, we must begin with his origins. Born in 1405 into one of the wealthiest noble families in western France, Gilles grew up in privilege. His family held vast lands in Brittany and Anjou, and his childhood was filled with the education and training expected of a young aristocrat. From an early age, he was surrounded by tutors who taught him Latin, history, theology, and the art of war. As a boy, he showed not only intelligence but also ambition. Chronicles describe him as tall, commanding, and eager to prove himself. His wealth gave him access to the finest armor, horses, and weapons, making him stand out among other knights. But Gilles was not just another noble youth. He carried a reputation for brilliance and charisma that impressed even seasoned warriors. The backdrop of his childhood was the 100 Years' War, a brutal conflict between France and England that devastated the countryside and tested the loyalty of every noble house. For Gilles, war was not an abstract concept. It was the environment in which he was raised, a proving ground that would shape his destiny. By the time he reached his 20s, Gilles had already begun to distinguish himself on the battlefield. His moment of true glory came in 1429, when he joined the army of a young peasant girl who claimed to be sent by God. Joan of Arc together, they marched to lift the siege of Orleans, a battle that would turn the tide of the war in France's favor. Gilles fought with extraordinary courage. Chroniclers describe him riding fearlessly into battle, rallying troops, and standing close to Joan herself as she carried her banner into the fray. For his bravery, King Charles VII elevated him to the rank of Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors possible. It was a title that placed him among the most respected men in the kingdom, alongside generals, princes, and great lords. In these years, Gilles was not feared, he was celebrated. He marched in religious processions, honored as one of Joan's closest companions. He attended court, surrounded by wealth, prestige, and admiration. He was seen as the very model of a French knight, loyal, devout, and brave. Yet even at the height of his glory, there were hints of what was to come. Gilles enjoyed luxury more than duty. He staged elaborate banquets, wore extravagant clothing, and developed a taste for theatrical spectacles. He seemed as drawn to performance and display as to war and faith. His inheritance, already vast, began to dwindle under the weight of his spending. The contrast between Joan of Arc and Gilles is striking. She embodied purity, sacrifice, and divine mission. He represented power, wealth, and earthly indulgence. When Joan was captured and executed in 1431, Gilles lost more than a friend. He lost the guiding light of his career. Without her, his path grew darker. After Joan's death, Gilles withdrew from the battlefield and turned increasingly to his estates. The once celebrated knight began to retreat into a world of opulence, art, and, eventually, rumors of strange practices. But in the eyes of history, it was his rise alongside Joan of Arc that made his later downfall so shocking. How could the same man who fought bravely for France's salvation become remembered as a figure of horror? His noble origins gave him wealth and influence. His courage in battle made him a hero. And yet, those very privileges gave him the power to act without restraint when darker impulses took hold. At this stage of his life, Gilles de Rais was not yet a monster. He was a knight, a marshal, and a symbol of France's victory. But the seeds of his decline were already there. Ambition, extravagance, and a restless spirit left unmoored after Joan's death. The stage was set for the transformation from hero to villain, and soon, the world would begin to see the cracks in the noble image he had built. The glory of Orleans and the honor of being named Marshal of France should have secured Gilles de Rais a place in history as a hero. Yet, after the execution of Joan of Arc in 1431, his life began to unravel. Without her divine mission to guide him, Gilles drifted into a world of excess, obsession, and ruin. At first, the decline seemed almost ordinary, the behavior of a nobleman who had lived too long in luxury. Gilles possessed vast estates, but instead of managing them carefully, he spent recklessly. He staged elaborate theatrical plays, known as mystery dramas, that rivaled even royal productions. These performances involved hundreds of actors, costumes made of silk and velvet, and sets decorated with gold and silver. Guests were stunned by the extravagance, but the cost was enormous. Within a few years, Gilles had burned through much of his inheritance. He also became infamous for his feasting. Chronicles describe banquets that lasted for days, with music, wine, roasted meats, and entertainment for noble guests. His appetite for spectacle and pleasure grew so great that he even began selling off parts of his estates to finance his lifestyle. By the late 1430s, he was on the verge of financial collapse. But money was not the only concern. Gilles began to surround himself with individuals who promised him forbidden knowledge. He turned to alchemists, astrologers, and occultists, seeking ways to restore his fortune. He believed in the possibility of transforming base metals into gold, and in rituals that might summon demons to provide him with power and wealth. These experiments were not only dangerous but also blasphemous in the eyes of the church. At the same time, whispers began to circulate in the countryside around his castles. Families claimed that their children disappeared after visiting his estates. Some said they were promised work in the kitchens or stables, only to vanish without a trace. At first, these rumors were dismissed as village gossip, the natural suspicion of peasants toward an eccentric lord. But as the number of disappearances grew, fear spread. What happened inside Gillis's castles remains the subject of debate. Later testimonies described a world of cruelty and indulgence, where children were lured inside with promises of food or opportunity, only to meet a grim fate. Whether these stories were entirely true or exaggerated by political enemies, the fact remains that too many children went missing for the whispers to be ignored. Gilles himself seemed to withdraw more and more from public life. He rarely appeared on the battlefield again, preferring the company of mystics and secret gatherings inside his halls. His wealth diminished, his reputation grew stranger, and the noble knight who once marched beside Joan of Arc now appeared to the outside world as a man spiraling out of control. By the end of the 1430s, the once glorious Marshal of France had become a figure of suspicion and fear. He was still respected by some at court, but for the peasants living in the shadow of his castles, he had become a nightmare. Stories of missing children, strange rituals, and eerie lights flickering from castle towers at night fed a growing sense of dread. The decline of Gilles de Rais was not sudden, but steady, a nobleman who could not manage his wealth, who sought forbidden answers in alchemy, and who let his darkest impulses consume him. His transformation from hero to villain was nearly complete. Soon, the whispers of the villages would reach the ears of kings and bishops, and Gilles de Rais would face consequences not even his noble birth could shield him from. By the late 1430s, Gilles de Rais had retreated into a shadowy world within the walls of his castles. What had once been centers of noble hospitality and military strength now became places of whispered terror. The man who had stood beside Joan of Arc in shining armor was now rumored to be hiding his darkest impulses behind stone walls and locked chambers. The stories came first from the peasants. Families living near his estates whispered that their children had been invited to work at the castle, to serve in the kitchens, help with chores, or learn trades. But those children never returned. Mothers wept at church altars, fathers begged soldiers for answers, yet silence hung over the noble halls. When pressed, servants denied knowledge, but fear flickered in their eyes. Later testimonies collected during Gillis's trial revealed disturbing details. Witnesses claimed that young boys and girls were lured into his chambers with promises of food, money, or clothing. What happened behind closed doors was described with horror. Punishments disguised as games, strange rituals, and humiliations that no child could endure. Some accounts spoke of torches flickering late into the night, the sound of crying echoing through stone corridors, and the nobleman's own laughter mingling with the screams. We must be cautious, though. Many of these testimonies were given under pressure or even torture. Historians today remind us that not every detail can be taken at face value. Yet the consistency of the stories is difficult to ignore. Too many voices from too many villages told the same tale. Children went into Gillis's castles and did not come back. Even within his household, fear was constant. Servants later admitted they lived in dread, not only of their master but of what they were forced to witness. Some described strange rituals involving Gillis's alchemists and astrologers, who promised him wealth and power through forbidden means. Candles burned at all hours. Symbols were drawn on parchment. Some whispered that Gilles invoked dark forces, hoping demons would restore his fortune. The peasants saw it differently. To them, the once gallant marshal had become something supernatural, a nobleman possessed, or perhaps in league with the devil himself. Tales spread of ghostly lights glowing in the castle towers, of shadows moving against torchlight, of Gilles himself appearing with a face twisted by cruelty. For villagers who lived in fear of famine, war, and disease, these stories only deepened the terror. If even a knight chosen by God to fight alongside Joan of Arc could fall, then nowhere was safe. By 1439, the number of missing children was impossible to dismiss. Priests began to speak out cautiously in sermons, warning of sins hidden in plain sight. Neighbors whispered about shallow graves, about bundles carried out under cover of darkness. Though no peasant dared to accuse Gilles openly, the fear was overwhelming. His castles were no longer fortresses of protection but symbols of dread. Some historians argue that the accounts of ritual killings and occult ceremonies were exaggerated by his political enemies, eager to bring him down and seize his lands. And yet, even the most skeptical scholars admit that dozens of children vanished in regions he controlled. Whether through superstition, cruelty, or sheer abuse of power, Gilles had become the center of a nightmare. The horror inside his castles was not only physical but also symbolic. He represented the corruption of chivalry itself. Knights were supposed to embody honor, courage, and the protection of the innocent. Gilles de Rais twisted that image into its opposite, a knight who preyed on the most defenseless. By now, the once proud Marshal was consumed by darkness. His wealth was nearly gone, his reputation collapsing, and his castles whispered about as haunted places of evil. For the peasants, he was no longer a hero or even a nobleman. He was a predator in armor, a man whose castles had become prisons of terror. And soon, those whispers would reach the ears of the church and the crown. What began as gossip in villages would grow into a case that shocked all of France, and finally brought Gilles de Rais to trial. By 1440, the whispers around Gilles de Rais had grown too loud to ignore. Entire villages were convinced that the Marshal of France was behind the disappearance of their children. Local priests and bishops, pressured by grieving parents, finally took action. What began as rumors soon turned into an official investigation, one that would uncover one of the most shocking trials in medieval history. It started in Brittany, when a dispute between Gilles and a local clergyman over church lands drew unwanted attention. The church, already suspicious of his behavior, seized the chance to investigate more deeply. Soon, officials began questioning peasants, servants, and members of his household. What they found was chilling. Testimony after testimony of missing children, of strange rituals, of cruelty hidden within castle walls. The evidence was overwhelming. By September 1440, Gilles was arrested and charged with crimes that stunned France: murder, heresy, sodomy, and witchcraft. The accusations were almost unthinkable. How could a Marshal of France, a knight once honored alongside Joan of Arc, be brought to trial like a criminal? Yet the sheer weight of testimony made it impossible to dismiss. The trial became a public spectacle. In the city of Nantes, crowds gathered as more than 100 witnesses testified. Parents wept as they described their missing children. Servants spoke of horrific things they had seen but were too afraid to reveal until now. Even priests described Gilles' obsession with alchemy and the occult, presenting it as proof of his pact with dark forces. At first, Gilles denied everything. He stood proud, dressed in the noble garments of his rank, and mocked the proceedings. But as the testimonies piled up, and under the pressure of interrogation, his confidence began to break. Finally, he confessed. His words shocked everyone present. He admitted to luring children, abusing them, and killing them, sometimes with his own hands. He described these acts with chilling calmness, as though he had long since lost all sense of guilt. Modern historians debate these confessions. Some argue that Gilles, facing certain death, exaggerated or even invented details under pressure, hoping for a quicker end. Others believe the weight of testimony leaves little room for doubt. Whatever the truth, the trial left France horrified. The church added its own accusations. Beyond the murders, Gilles was charged with heresy and invoking demons through alchemy. He had hired occultists, performed rituals, and sought wealth through forbidden means. To medieval minds, this was as damning as the crimes themselves. The image of a noble knight bargaining with dark forces only deepened the sense that Gilles was not just a criminal. He was a monster. The trial lasted several weeks, and by the end, the verdict was inevitable. Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, once a hero of Orleans, was found guilty on all charges. The announcement sent shockwaves across the kingdom. How could a man who had marched with Joan of Arc now stand condemned as a murderer and heretic? For the common people, the trial confirmed what they had long suspected. The powerful were capable of horrors beyond imagination. For the nobility, it was a warning that even the highest titles offered no protection from justice. And for the church, it was a chance to demonstrate its authority, showing that no man, not even a marshal, could defy God's laws. By October 1440, Giles's fate was sealed. His execution was set. The once glorious knight who had fought for France's salvation was now condemned to die as one of its darkest villains. On the morning of October 26, 1440, the city of Nantes awoke to witness the downfall of a man who had once been celebrated as a national hero. Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, decorated knight, and companion of Joan of Arc, was led to the gallows. He was dressed not in shining armor but in the plain robes of a condemned man. Thousands gathered in silence, their faces filled with a mix of sorrow, horror, and grim satisfaction. The execution was staged with ritual solemnity. First, Gilles was led to the scaffold alongside two of his closest accomplices. A priest offered him the chance for repentance. In a surprising turn, witnesses say Gilles appeared calm, even devout in his final hours. He prayed, confessed his sins, and begged forgiveness from God and the families of his victims. Some reports even describe him comforting those who wept around him, as if trying to reclaim a shred of dignity before the end. Then the sentence was carried out. Gilles was hanged and his body burned, erasing the last trace of the marshal who had once stood at the right hand of kings. For the crowd, it was both justice and tragedy. Justice for the countless families who had lost their children, and tragedy because France had once hailed him as a savior. The legacy of Gilles de Rais is one of haunting contradiction. Was he truly guilty of every crime attributed to him, or was he partly the victim of political enemies eager to seize his wealth and lands? Historians continue to debate this question. His confessions were obtained under immense pressure, and medieval trials often blurred the line between truth and theater. Some argue that his occult experiments and financial ruin made him an easy target for the church, which sought to demonstrate its power. And yet, even the most cautious scholars admit that the sheer number of missing children cannot be ignored. Whether every detail of the accusations was true or not, the terror that gripped the villages around his castles was real. For parents who had lost sons and daughters, Gilles was no tragic nobleman framed by enemies. He was the very face of evil. In the centuries that followed, his legend grew darker. Stories painted him as a medieval monster, a predecessor to later serial killers. Some compared him to Elizabeth Bathory, others to Jack the Ripper. His name became synonymous with cruelty hidden behind nobility, a reminder that titles and honors can mask unimaginable darkness. But there is another irony in his legacy. In literature and folklore, Gilles de Rais has often been linked with the story of Bluebeard, the fairy-tale nobleman who murdered his wives in secret chambers. Though not directly connected, the parallels are striking. Wealth, power, and horrific secrets hidden within a castle. It seems that history and myth fused together, turning Gilles into both a historical figure and a cautionary tale. Today, Gilles de Rais remains one of the most unsettling figures of medieval Europe. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How could a man once praised as a hero commit such horrors? How much of his downfall was the result of true evil, and how much was shaped by the politics of his time? Was he a monster in armor, or a nobleman destroyed by forces larger than himself? The truth may never be fully known. But what is certain is that Gilles de Rais embodies one of the darkest paradoxes of history. That a man can fight for salvation one day and be remembered as a demon the next. His story is not only about crime and punishment but about the fragility of human virtue, and the terrifying ease with which glory can collapse into infamy.